So, madalas ini-equate natin yung sensory evaluation sa taste test, and usually taste is something that you would be a non-negotiable for us. Di bale ng pangit yung appearance or yung amoy niya or weird yung texture. Pero pag ayaw mo yung lasa, um, hindi mo talaga siya kakainin. So obviously we use the tongue primarily for the sense of taste, and two distinct things that we distinguish is taste, which is generally salty, sweet, sour, bitter, or umami, caused by soluble substances in the mouth, while flavor is a combination of five basic tastes, and add to that the feeling factors, no, yung mga kung maanghang siya, ganon, and volatile components which reach the olfactory area that give us a perception of the flavor. No? So inside the mouth we have taste buds, and these are receptors for basic taste, and they are sensitive to the taste containing compounds in our food. So papillae are those nodules or bumps you can see on the surface of the tongue, and depending on where they are located, so iba-iba yung kanilang mga pangalan. Perhaps maybe in your elementary or high school days, you might have been taught that certain tastes can be detected only in certain parts of the tongue, but apparently this no longer holds true. No? So any part of the tongue could detect any of the basic tastes. So again, we sense taste through the taste buds as seen in the illustration, and these nerve fibers from the taste cells carry the electric impulses to the brain. So as usual, it's the brain that tells us kung ano yung lasa na natitikman natin. Similar to aroma, yung taste receptor proteins ay meron, but for this one, it's specific to each basic taste, no? And they have the names as can be seen there. And all mechanisms essentially lead to the accumulation of calcium ions in the cell, and then this leads to the releasing of the signals that causes our brain to identify these chemicals. So for the salt receptors, actually the transduction of salty taste in humans is not yet fully understood. However, studies show that sodium ions enter into the cells through what we call the epithelial sodium channels. And actually, it's not just sodium that gives off that signal, but also most popular alternative would be potassium salts as a dietary substitute for sodium. However, people have complained that it has a metallic aftertaste. There's a train of thought before na yung bitter taste perception ay nag-evolve daw dahil ang tao ay kailangang umiwas sa mga poisonous substances. But recent studies on primitive traditional tribes people indicate that this was not the case, no? So there was no extra perception to bitterness based on kung anong isang society ay hunter-gatherer or hindi. Anyway, as with other taste receptors, the T2R receptors are seen as a subset of all papillae, and therefore can be perceived in other parts of the tongue as well na merong receptors. And as usual, when the bitter compound molecules bind to the receptors, so you activate an enzyme that causes the release of calcium ions and eventually the perception of bitter taste. We know that most sour substances are associated with acids, and they have in common yung kanilang mga H plus ions, and therefore all of the mechanisms which could possibly explain sour taste perception involve those that have ion channels such as yung sa sodium channels, yung same channels used for saltiness rather, and the proton channels, all of which lead to the release of calcium ions. So just like with anosmia, there is what we call taste blindness. Generally, it's related to the ability to react to bitter substances. Pero in extension, parang ito na rin yung nagdi-dictate kung gaano ka-sensitive yung ika nga yung taste buds mo sa pag-perceive ng small differences in flavor or yung threshold level mo for certain substances. And generally, we have what we call the hypotaster, the normal taster, and the super taster. So if you dye your tongue, DYE, you could see gaano ka-dense yung concentration ng taste buds, and that could be one way of determining kung ano yung iyong tinatawag nating taster status. Okay? So generally, the super tasters are very sensitive to bitter compounds, and among Filipinos, medyo malaki supposed to be yung percentage ng super tasters natin. And the hypotasters are more likely to be those na malakas ang tolerance for alcohol. So one of the studies conducted by Dr. Villarino is related to the prop or 6N-propylthiouracil, which is a bitter compound na depende sa taster status mo ay pwedeng sensitive ka dito or halos hindi mo siya malasahan at low concentrations. I was part again of this test before when I was a student. We were taken in as one of the test subjects, and well, for me, sobrang pait ng prop. Although I don't think that makes me a very good taster, because other than my perception for bitter compounds, hindi naman ako ganun galing mag-identify o mag-elucidate ng multiple taste compounds in a complicated flavor or aroma. So when designing sensory tests, normally we would want to consider as well yung sample in terms of yung taste niya. So we have what we call thresholds. So this is the lowest concentration at which the stimulus could be identified. These are for standardized tests like kung magtitimpla ka ng, let's say, sugar solutions, salt solutions, etc. So may mga proper concentrations yon na related sa average na kayang i-determine ng general public. And typically, we would want to arrange the tastes in this order: sweetness, saltiness, sourness, and bitterness when it comes to thresholds. So, kumbaga, to get the same level of intensity of a certain basic taste, you would need a lot more sugar, and kumbaga grams ang bilangan. Tapos pagdating sa bitterness, you only need milligrams of a bitter substance to be diluted into the same amount of water to get that perceived intensity. Generally, in terms of response, since we know that iba-iba yung channels na dinadaanan nila, yung perception mo ng, let's say, saltiness is much faster than, let's say, for detecting sourness or citric acid. Okay, and then, of course, meron tayong tinatawag na adaptation or a decrease in sensitivity to a given taste or intensity of a flavor dahil nasanay ka na. Like, maybe as a result of me working in an ice cream factory, what other people consider sweet sa akin ay hindi pa. And because of aversion to alcoholic beverage, what others consider as hindi mapait, for me ay sobrang pait na. Okay, unless the experimental design so requires, generally we want the weakest intensity of a stimuli to be evaluated first and the strongest last, no? Kasi nga may carryover effects yan. Although when randomization is required, then syempre we would have to mitigate the carryover effects with other means like a rest period, or maybe may inumin ka in between na makakapag-neutralize ng dila mo. And then synergistic effects or on taste, no? So um, when you have salty taste, it increases the perception of acidity but decreases sweetness. Acidity may increase or decrease sweetness, and then sugars generally decrease saltiness and some other taste. So parang minsan may masking effect, minsan naman may mga um, synergistic perceptions. Of course, these are all in the mind mostly, no? Unless in some way nagkakaroon ng competition dun sa mga perception channels nila. But again, unfortunately, this perception is something not yet fully understood by humans in the 21st century. So in all of these, it's considered good practice that you rinse before and after taking the sample, either with water or depende sa food mo, baka iba yung palate cleanser na ginagamit for your sample. Minsan milk, depende na kung ano yung food sample mo. So just like anosmia, we have genetic defects or maybe pag nagkasakit ka, defects related to taste function. Complete loss is ageusia. So just to remember this, pag anosmia, nose, okay, then you may have decreased sensitivity or having an increased threshold for basic tastes, hypergeusia or enhanced sensitivity, dysgeusia or unpleasant perception. So, magiging offensive or iba yung lasa. And lastly is phantogeusia or wala ka namang talagang nalalasahan pero feeling mo meron. I don't know if this is purely psychological or perhaps kasi kung wala namang um, receptor na nagbabind dun sa kung walang nagbabind dun sa receptor mo, wala naman dapat synapse na maganap unless there's a defect in your tongue na yung binders ay yung synapse ay mag-isang gumagalaw kahit walang nakabind. So when we evaluate the sense of taste, this usually involves not just yung basic taste but also olfactory sensations such as vanilla, chicken, potato, and the likes, no? Mga parang anong flavor niyan, parang ganon. And the the feeling factors such as maanghang, parang minty, malamig sa bibig, masakit sa labi, or yung astringency or metallic taste even. Para naman sa atin na mahilig sa fatty foods, there is something we call the oleogustus or a taste sensation elicited by long-chain fatty acids. So, I think this is self-explanatory if you like fats, no? And medyo may konting sarap na nararamdaman kapag fatty yung food natin.